It arrived in the mailbox like any other piece of mail, a thick, cream-colored envelope nestled between a utility bill and a catalog for garden supplies. There was no elegant handwriting, no familiar return address, just a printed label with my name, Eleanor Vance, centered in a stark, impersonal font. It was as if someone had selected a name from a database and pressed print without a second thought. I slid it open carefully with my late husband's silver letter opener, a ritual I still maintained. Inside was a formal invitation, engraved on heavy cardstock, for the 10th anniversary party of my son Leo and his wife Isabel. But something about its sterile perfection made my chest tighten with a familiar cold dread. There was no handwritten note in the margin, no love, Leo and Isabel, no scribbled hope you can make it, Mom. Just the cold, unyielding formality of a time, a date, and a place. The Ashford Gallery, 8 p.m. It was the kind of message you'd send to a distant business associate or a neighbor you barely knew. Not a mother, not a grandmother. It felt less like an invitation and more like a summons, or perhaps a final chilling statement. Something deep in the marrow of my bones, a primal instinct honed by years of quiet observation, knew I wasn't truly wanted there. I sat at the antique oak table in my sun-drenched kitchen, the card resting beside my half-empty teacup. The afternoon light spilled across the polished wood, illuminating the crisp, sharp corners of the invitation. It smelled faintly of expensive ink and processed paper, a scent devoid of warmth or human touch. I turned it over once, then twice, searching for a sign, a mistake, anything to suggest this was a thoughtless oversight. There was nothing. It wasn't the kind of invitation you press between the pages of a book or save in a velvet-lined memory box. It was the kind you toss into a drawer and forget, an artifact of a relationship that had become purely functional. But I couldn't forget. This would be their 10th anniversary. I remembered their wedding as if it were yesterday, a whirlwind of white roses and nervous laughter. Leo had beamed with such genuine pride when I walked down the aisle. Even Isabel, in a rare moment of unguarded warmth, had squeezed my hand and asked for my secret to a long marriage. Patience, I had whispered, and a short memory for slights. It seemed she had only remembered the first part of that advice. Now, all I had was this card, as empty and polished as her ambition. I placed it next to my teacup, watching the steam curl upward as if it were trying to carry my troubled thoughts away with it. Part of me, the tired, weary part, wanted to ignore it, to finally take the hint and retreat into the quiet solitude of my life. But another part, an older, more stubborn part that had built architectural marvels from steel and stone, refused to be dismissed like a piece of junk mail. Maybe some of you listening have felt it too, that glacial shift in a family's climate. It never happens all at once, in a single dramatic storm. It's a slow, insidious cooling, a series of barely noticeable temperature drops, until one day you realize the warmth has completely drained out, and you are standing alone on the frozen porch of something you used to call home. Still, I told myself it could be nothing, a simple mistake. Maybe they were overwhelmed with the planning. Maybe they had used a professional service that discouraged personal touches. Maybe, but even as I tried to convince myself, I already knew the truth. This wasn't an oversight. It was a message, meticulously crafted and delivered, and I wasn't sure I was ready to decipher what it truly meant. I placed the invitation on the small mahogany console table in the hallway, propped against a silver-framed photograph of my granddaughter, Sophie. I left it there for 3 days, a silent, mocking sentinel. Every time I passed by on my way to water the plants or check the mail, I would glance at it, a ridiculous, flickering hope in my heart that a handwritten note might magically appear on its surface. Of course, it never did. But on the 4th morning, as the sun streamed through the front door's glass panels, I found myself reaching for it again. Not to question its cold intent, but to accept it. I had decided I would go. It wasn't pride or a foolish hope for reconciliation that pushed me. It was something quieter, more fundamental. It was the memory of Sophie's tiny, trusting hand gripping mine at the Boston Public Garden, the way she used to trace the intricate illustrations in the old book of architectural wonders I kept on my shelf. I remembered promising her I would explain every arch, every buttress, every spire, until she could see the stories hidden in the city's skyline on her own. That book, a heavy tome bound in fading green cloth, became the first item I set aside for my anniversary gift to them. I pulled a small, cedar-lined box from the top of the linen closet. Inside were relics of a life I was beginning to feel was no longer mine. Photographs, postcards, old letters from my husband, Richard. Tucked at the very bottom, wrapped in silk paper, was the book. I opened it slowly. The pages were brittle, and a few of the corners were torn, but the detailed architectural drawings still held their vibrant, precise beauty. I placed it gently into a simple, elegant gift bag lined with silver tissue paper. Then I moved to the kitchen. I hadn't baked in months, but my hands, like old, faithful servants, found their rhythm quickly. Butter, sugar, flour, lemon zest. The same lemon shortbread cookies Sophie used to ask for every time she visited, the ones Isabel once claimed were divine. The familiar sweet scent filled the house like an old comforting lullaby, a ghost of happier times. I packed the cookies in a vintage tin, carefully layering parchment paper between each perfect row. Once both gifts were ready, I sat in my favorite armchair, my hands resting in my lap. A strange calm washed over me, a complete absence of butterflies or anxious expectations. It was a quiet readiness, a feeling of inevitability, as if my body had already accepted and processed whatever was coming. Before leaving, I wrote a small card for Leo and Isabel. Just a few lines in my neat architectural script, nothing heavy or sentimental. Wishing you both a happy 10th anniversary and many more to come. I slid it between the pages of the architecture book, right at the chapter on the great cathedrals of Europe, where the story of enduring structures began. And I wrapped everything carefully, checked the gallery's address twice, and stepped outside. The sky was overcast, a flat, uniform gray that made the vibrant autumn leaves on the trees seem muted and sad. I took a slow, deep breath, locked the door behind me, and walked toward my car. I didn't call ahead. I didn't send a text. I didn't ask for permission to attend a party to which I had been, in the most technical sense, invited. I simply followed the quiet, insistent thread of something unfinished, something that was still beating beneath all the layers of silence and polite avoidance. The drive into Boston was long but achingly familiar. Every turn, every landmark held a memory. The bench by the Charles River where Leo took his first steps, the ice cream parlor where he'd celebrated his 10th birthday, and finally, the historic neighborhood where their apartment was, its stately brownstones and gas-lit lamps a world away from my quiet suburban street. I pulled up across from the gallery and sat for a moment, the engine idling, watching elegantly dressed couples come and go with wrapped boxes and bottles of champagne. Laughter, faint and musical, spilled out whenever the heavy glass doors opened. It was the sound of celebration, a world to which I was no longer sure I belonged. I looked down at the gift bag and the cookie tin on the passenger seat, then gathered them gently in my arms. One last fortifying breath, one steady step forward. I crossed the cobblestone street and walked toward the gallery doors. Whatever waited for me behind them, I had shown up. In my world, that still mattered, even if it no longer did in theirs. The gallery was housed in a renovated warehouse, its industrial chic facade a stark contrast to the historic charm of the neighborhood. A velvet rope and a well-dressed doorman guarded the entrance. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see a sea of people, their silhouettes moving against the brightly lit artwork. Music pulsed faintly through the glass. The place looked just as Isabel had described it in a rare, enthusiastic phone call months ago, but it felt utterly foreign, a scene from a movie in which I had not been cast. I climbed the shallow concrete steps, careful not to jostle the cookie tin. My hand reached for the heavy chrome handle, but before I could pull it, the door opened. Leo stood there. His face was a carefully composed mask. Not angry, not warm, just unnervingly still. He didn't look surprised, almost as if he had been waiting by the door, a sentinel posted to intercept me. We stood like that for a few seconds that stretched into an eternity, him in the doorway, blocking the warmth and light from within, me on the cold sidewalk, holding the gifts. Then he stepped outside, his movements stiff and rehearsed, and gently pulled the door closed behind him. I heard the latch click, a quiet, metallic sound that echoed with a dreadful finality. He didn't speak right away. His eyes dropped to the gift bag, then the cookie tin, then back up to meet mine. "Mom," he began, his voice low, almost a whisper. I opened my mouth to respond, but he lifted one hand just slightly. Not to stop me, but as a signal, a gesture he had clearly practiced. He said, his voice gentle but firm, that it would be better if I didn't come in. It was the kind of tone people use when they're delivering bad news from a script, like a doctor reading a diagnosis from a chart. "This isn't personal," his tone said. "It's just procedure." He told me it wasn't a good idea, that it might make things uncomfortable, that Isabel had worked so hard on everything and didn't want any distractions. Each word was a small, sharp stone, carefully chosen and aimed. Then he paused, as if gathering the courage to deliver the final killing blow. "We just feel," he said, "and I will remember these words until the day I die, that you're not really a part of this life anymore." He didn't say it in a cruel way. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even make eye contact when he said it. He looked down at the concrete at our feet as if the phrase had been written there, and he was just reading it aloud for the first time. My arms didn't move. I kept holding the gifts as if they still had a destination, as if someone inside might open the door at any second, laugh at the absurdity of it all, and tell him he was being ridiculous. But no one did. Through the glass, I saw Isabel moving through the crowd, a champagne flute in her hand, smiling, completely oblivious, or, more likely, completely indifferent. "Does Sophie know I came?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. He didn't answer. He just looked past me, toward the street, as if he were waiting for a taxi to arrive and whisk this awkward moment away. I stood there for another long, painful breath. Then, without a word, I held out the gift bag and the tin. There was nothing left to say that would ever reach the place it needed to go. He took them with that same practiced, emotionless stillness and turned the handle behind him. The door opened, swallowing him into the light and noise, and then it closed again, leaving me in the cold and the dark. I walked back to my car, not in anger, not even in sadness, but in that strange, hollowed-out silence where something inside you shifts slowly, irrevocably, and permanently. I didn't start the engine right away. I sat there for a long time, watching the joyful, oblivious silhouettes in the window, wondering how something so full of life could feel so completely, utterly unreachable. That was the moment the door truly closed. Not just the glass and steel door of the gallery, but the door on the version of me that still waited, foolishly, to be invited in. When I got home, I didn't take off my coat. I stood in the silent hallway for a long time, staring at the empty space above the console table where I used to hang family pictures. There had been one of Leo there for years, a photo of him holding a tiny, bundled Sophie, but I had taken it down last spring. I remember telling myself it was just to dust the frame, but I had never put it back up. Some part of me had known even then. I moved to the kitchen and made myself a cup of tea, my movements slow and deliberate. The silence in the house, usually a comfort, pressed in on me, heavy and suffocating. There was no sound except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Later that evening, just as the sky was dimming into a bruised purple dusk, my phone buzzed on the counter. It was a message from Isabel. She didn't bother with a greeting. The text simply read, "Don't make this into a scene." Leo already explained everything. There was no warmth in it, no curiosity about whether I had gotten home safely, no hint of regret. It was a warning, a command, as if I had done something transgressive simply by showing up with a gift. I didn't respond. I set the phone face down on the table and stared at the wall, tracing the patterns in the wallpaper with my eyes. I don't remember exactly how long I sat like that, lost in a fog of disbelief and a grief so profound it had no name. At some point, I got up and walked to the study. I reached past the neat rows of books on architecture and history and pulled out an old leather-bound filing box. It smelled of cedar and thyme. Inside were documents I hadn't touched in years, deeds, old tax papers, letters from Richard when he was overseeing a project in Japan. Buried near the bottom, in a crisp, unmarked folder, was what I had been subconsciously looking for: the deed to the historic brownstone in Beacon Hill. The first project I had ever undertaken as a young, ambitious architect. The place Leo and Isabel had been using for years as their city pied-à-terre. The place Leo thought was already his. I ran my fingers over the elegant looping script at the top of the page. Eleanor Vance. My name. Still my name. There was no transfer, no co-signature. He had always assumed, with the blithe entitlement of a favored son, that once he turned 40, the brownstone would naturally, magically, pass to him. He talked about it as if it were already his. The summer he said he'd renovate the rooftop garden, the custom library shelves he planned to install. It was a cornerstone of the life he was building, the story he was telling the world about himself. But he had never actually asked, and I, weary of the constant, subtle battles, had never explicitly said yes. Back then, I told myself I was just giving him space, allowing him to feel a sense of ownership and responsibility. But in truth, I was tired. I was tired of explaining, tired of having my opinions gently dismissed, tired of being reminded that my input no longer mattered to him unless it perfectly aligned with what he and Isabel wanted. So I had let his assumption fester, unchecked. I folded the heavy document gently and placed it on the desk beside me. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like a ghost in my own life. I felt the solid, reassuring weight of my own existence. Isabel's cold, dismissive message was meant to shut me down, to put me back in my place. Instead, it had opened a door I had quietly bolted years ago, because what they, in their arrogant certainty, didn't know was this: I had never signed anything over. And if they were comfortable pushing me out of their lives, they might want to think twice about building their future on a foundation that didn't actually belong to them. Not yet. And now, perhaps, not ever. The following morning, I met Linda Alvarez in her modest office downtown, a space tucked between a bustling bakery and an old, quiet bookstore. The office was small but impeccably organized, and everything about her, from her sharp, tailored suit to her direct, intelligent gaze, conveyed a sense of no-nonsense competence. My old friend Margaret, a retired judge with a formidable reputation, had already briefed her. Linda had the scanned deed, the public property records, and, surprisingly, a copy of the financing prospectus for Isabel's new gallery venture. She had highlighted a key section in yellow. Your son and his wife are using the Beacon Hill property as a significant collateral asset, she stated, her voice calm and measured. It becomes a problem, a very serious one, given that the title is still entirely and solely under your name. I kept my face a steady, unreadable mask, though my stomach was twisting into a tight, angry knot. He claimed it was an inheritance, passed down to him with no dispute, Linda continued, tapping her pen against the screen, and that no other party has ever contested ownership. I shook my head, a single, sharp movement. I never signed a transfer. I never agreed to joint ownership. That place was mine before Leo was even born. I restored it from a ruin with my own 2 hands. Linda nodded, then leaned forward, her elbows resting on her polished desk. You hold the title, Eleanor. That gives you complete and total legal control. But if you don't take formal action, their lenders might move forward under the assumption that his claim is valid. We need to put them, and the world, on notice. I sat back in the plush leather chair and stared out the window at the bustling street below. I didn't want to sell it. It was more than bricks and mortar to me. It was a testament to my life's work. But I certainly wasn't going to let them build their glittering, empty dreams on a foundation they had so casually pushed me out of. Linda listened patiently. Then she offered the next logical step, filing a formal notice of claim, also known as a lis pendens. It would officially and publicly alert banks, investors, and any other interested parties that the brownstones' ownership was in dispute. It wasn't an aggressive lawsuit, but a firm, unyielding declaration of fact. Once that's filed, she explained, Leo cannot legally use the property for leverage. It effectively freezes its financial utility, and you won't need to confront him directly. I'll handle all communication from that point forward. If they attempt to contact you, you simply forward them to my office. She slid the necessary papers across the desk. I picked up the heavy, ink-filled pen. My hand didn't shake. As I signed my name, I felt something shift deep in my chest. It wasn't fear or regret. It was the liberating feeling of a great weight being lifted from my shoulders. I had stayed quiet for far too long. I had allowed sentiment and a misguided desire for peace to cloud my judgment and erode my position. But this place, this beautiful historic brownstone, was more than just a valuable asset. It held memories of my late husband's unwavering support, of pancake mornings with a young Leo, of quiet evenings spent sketching by the fire with the sound of the city humming below. Linda stood and walked me to the elevator. Just a heads up, she said, her tone softening slightly. This might rattle some people. The truth has a way of shaking the tree. I turned to her, my posture straighter and my voice steadier than it had been in years. Then let it shake. The notice went out on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday evening, I had 8 missed calls from Leo and 3 increasingly frantic voicemails, which I dutifully forwarded to Linda's office without listening to them. I also received a long, rambling email from Isabel, filled with carefully chosen words like concern and misunderstanding and profoundly hurtful. I wasn't confused. I was crystal clear. I didn't respond. Instead, I packed a small weekend bag, called Margaret, and drove up to my little cottage on the North Shore. The cottage had always been my retreat, but that weekend, it felt like something more. It felt like a reclamation. When we arrived, the salt-laced wind carried the familiar scent of pine and the sea. The first thing I did was head to the kitchen. I opened the drawers, straightened the silverware, and tossed out expired spices. Margaret, ever practical, swept the floors and pulled back the curtains, letting the sunlight flood the dusty rooms. We worked in a comfortable silence, old friends who understood that some things didn't need to be spoken aloud. That evening, as we sat on the porch wrapped in thick woolen blankets, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Leo. I saw the legal claim. You've made your point, but this is going to ruin things for me. I stared at the screen for a long time, at the casual, self-centered cruelty of his words. Then, with a sense of profound finality, I turned off my phone and tucked it into a drawer beside an old forgotten shell collection. By Saturday morning, the fog had lifted from the choppy waters of the Atlantic. At 10 o'clock a.m., a sleek silver SUV, a car completely out of place in our quiet, unpretentious neighborhood, pulled up the gravel drive. A man in his early 40s, dressed in a trim, expensive suit and polished shoes not meant for the uneven ground, stepped out. He didn't look at the ocean or the seagulls circling overhead. He walked straight to the porch with the air of a man who had somewhere much better to be. I opened the door before he could knock. "Mrs. Vance," he said, adjusting the strap on his leather briefcase. "My name is Matthew Klein. I represent your son." I let him in without a word. Margaret, who had been reading in the living room, glanced up over her glasses, but said nothing. He opened his case and pulled out a folder. He spoke calmly, deliberately, his words smooth and practiced. "Leo and Isabel wish to resolve this matter without further escalation. They are willing to make a significant financial offer in exchange for your cooperation in transferring the property title." He slid the folder across the table. I didn't touch it. I stood, walked to the mantelpiece, and picked up a framed photograph. It was of a young Leo, no older than 7, proudly holding up a small fish he had caught off the local pier, my late husband's arm around his shoulder. "This is not just property, Mr. Klein," I said, my voice quiet but unyielding. "This is memory. This is family. This is the last place my husband saw before he passed away, and my name is still on the deed." Mr. Klein didn't flinch. "You should know," he said, his tone shifting almost imperceptibly. "This is already affecting your son's investors." I let his veiled threat hang in the air for a moment. Then I said, "Everyone has to live with the consequences of their own choices." I closed the door gently behind him. That night, I burned the folder he had left behind, page by page, in the fireplace. The flames curled around each offer, each signature line, each threat dressed in courtesy. I didn't need their money. I already had what they never would: a place that remembered me, and a conscience that was clear. A week later, just as the last of the autumn leaves were clinging to the branches, the front doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened it to find Sophie standing on the porch, her school backpack slung over one shoulder, her cheeks pink from the cold. She was holding a small, worn tote bag, and her eyes, so much like her father's, were wide and uncertain. "Sophie, darling, what are you doing here?" I asked, my heart lurching with a mixture of joy and alarm. She walked past me into the house, dropped her bag on the floor, and simply reached out her arms. I dropped to my knees and held her, this precious, forgotten piece of my heart. She wrapped herself around me, her small body trembling slightly, and held on as if she were afraid I might disappear. Later, curled up on the sofa with a cup of hot chocolate, she told me everything. Her words came in a rush, a torrent of things she had been holding inside for too long. "Mommy said we weren't to talk about you," she whispered. "She said you were being difficult. Daddy never talks about you at all anymore. I didn't know where you went." She told me she had taken the train, using the emergency money I had given her years ago for her birthday. "I just wanted to see you," she said, her voice cracking. "I miss you." We spent the rest of the afternoon making the lemon shortbread cookies. She remembered the star-shaped cookie cutter, and she remembered how to press a thumbprint into the center of each one. As we worked, a sense of peace, a feeling of rightness, settled over me. This was what mattered. This was the legacy I cared about. That evening I drove her home. As we pulled up to their perfectly manicured house, the front door opened and Isabel rushed out, her face a mask of fury. She started yelling, not at Sophie, but at me, accusing me of manipulating her child, of creating drama. I didn't engage, I simply waited until Sophie was safely inside, then looked at Isabel, my expression calm and unreadable. "She missed her grandmother," I said softly. "It's as simple as that." And I drove away, leaving her standing on the sidewalk, speechless for the first time in her life. The morning sun stretched over the quiet suburban street as I walked down the driveway to retrieve my newspaper. A new sign had been mounted to the post by the entrance to the Beacon Hill brownstone, a discreet but elegant plaque that read, "The Richard and Eleanor Vance Foundation for Emerging Architects." The cabin was no longer mine in the way it had once been, but it belonged to something larger now, a cause, a purpose. I hadn't just let go of a deed, I had chosen what it would become. The paperwork had been finalized the day before. The nonprofit I had established would provide a year-long, rent-free residency for a promising young female architect, a chance for them to live and work in the heart of the city, a chance I had fought so hard for myself all those years ago. A local architecture journal had sent a photographer to cover the story. I stood for a photo in front of the grand fireplace, my back straight, one hand resting on the cool marble of the mantel. Above me hung the framed architectural drawing I had intended to give as an anniversary gift. In that moment, I realized I was no longer just a bystander in my own story. I was the narrator, the architect, the keeper of memory, and the master of my own choices. Later, I walked to the rooftop garden, now being tended by a group of eager volunteers. The city skyline stretched out before me, a testament to human ambition and endurance. This place, once built by a woman finding her own way, would now serve as a beacon for others to do the same. As I watched a group of young students discussing blueprints, I smiled. Some stories don't end with a final, neat chapter. They shift. They echo forward in other lives. Mine would echo here. If this story touched something inside you, if you've ever felt pushed aside, forgotten, or quietly erased, know this: your name still matters. Your presence carries weight. And sometimes, reclaiming yourself begins not with a shout, but with one quiet, unshakable choice: